year. And to mark the moment, we have over the course of the last few months been organizing a series of lectures where we have invited friends of the institution who've been part of the institution and whose work has deeply influenced much of what the scholars in the institution of today do, and people from whom we've learned, and also colleagues who have been working on issues that CPR has, over the decades, played some role in the shaping of the public discourse around. So it's a real pleasure that we have today in our midst Suhasini Haider, who's a friend of the institution, a long-standing friend of the institution, whose work on foreign policy has educated most of us, and certainly me. That's the first thing I read. And then, of course, I read Ambassador Saran and Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay. But it's, well, you know, first you and then everyone else. But really and not just for all that we have learned, but also I asked Suhasini to speak to us about South Asia. And that, as part of CPR, is particularly special because the institution, back in the 1980s, as over these last few months, we've been digging into the archives of the institution and learning a lot about its history. And one of the first things that CPR did in the early 1980s, which was really only 5 or 6 years into the institution's founding, was to get ahead of the game in some senses on pushing the framework for how to think about regionalism within South Asia. So CPR's work on South Asia actually begins a few years before SAARC. So we were ahead of the curve, and some of the country's leading thinkers, Pran Chopra, Bhabani Sen Gupta, amongst others, found home here in the early 1980s to make and shape many aspects of what eventually became part and parcel of how we frame South Asian regional connectivity, the idea actually of South Asia. So I requested Suhasini, who is one of, over the years, when we talk about foreign policy, South Asia has sort of fallen off the map. And both the ambassadors sitting here have reminded me consistently and taught me how central the neighborhood is to any imagination of what a great power can be or should be. And there's always been this central question in our foreign policy quest around what does it mean to seek or emerge as a great power without taking your neighborhood along with you. We have a shared history, we have shared boundaries, we have a complicated relationship within our neighborhood, but there's no question of avoiding it. We have to find a way of working together, living together, and rising together. And in a lot of Suhasini's writing, she's one of the few people that have consistently and constantly made this point. So it seemed to me, as I was thinking about what should be the foreign policy lecture that would mark CPR's 50th, that this is the one place that should talk about South Asia, and she is the one person who should be giving us this lecture. So thank you very, very much, Suhasini. It's a real privilege for us to have you here and for agreeing to talk on a subject that is so dear to this institution that has shaped its own approach to foreign policy. And I requested Ambassador Shyam Saran to chair the session because more than anyone else, he has led the charge on South Asia in CPR in this contemporary moment over the last 10, 15 years of his association with the institution. So over to you, Ambassador Saran, to introduce Suhasini and to introduce the conversation today.
Thank you very much, Yamini. And first of all, congratulations to CPR family on the celebration of its 50th anniversary. 50 years, a trajectory which has been really marked with really some pioneering work on not just foreign policy issue, but on issues of Indian society, economics, on all virtually every domain, climate change, that this institution has really made pioneering contributions. So the 50th birthday, congratulations. And let me also welcome Suhasini. who will be delivering a lecture on South Asia. I don't really need to introduce Suhasini because she has been a very, very visible figure, first in television and then in print and now in podcasts. So virtually every medium of communication that you can think of, she has been right there. And of course, today, she is one of the leading voices on foreign policy issues at a time where there is a considerable degree of, being encouraged to think in somewhat narrow kind of ways about India's role in the world and in the region. She's one person who has consistently taken a much larger view of what India's interests are. And in that context, of course, the focus on our neighborhood. Now, it should come as no surprise to any one of you, because I have written time and time again that if you can't get your neighborhood right, then any aspiration to play a larger regional role or a larger global role is simply not going to happen. So the first order of business is the neighborhood. We were successful during the time of Dr. Manmohan Singh to get this concept across, neighborhood first. Many people think that neighborhood first is a recent kind of concept, but that's not the case. Actually, this was brought into our discourse during that time, and considerable amount of progress was actually made in terms of promoting India's relationship with the neighbors. We must also give credit to Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who at a SAARC summit actually put forward some very, very radical ideas for the region, talking about a customs union, talking about even a directly elected SAARC parliament. He also spoke about a common currency. So those were really big ideas that were put on the table at that time. Of course, we have not been able to move very much in that direction. I would say that one area where a considerable amount of progress has been made, and perhaps you can address it, is the issue of connectivity. This was again something which we did not see much progress on before, because of the sense, I think a very deep-rooted sense that India as a country is surrounded by hostile neighbors, and you have to have big walls around yourself to make yourself safe, not really looking at cross-border, in fact, relations as something that could actually add to your economic prosperity. And that is something that to some extent has been accepted, and must give credit also to this government, which at least in terms of physical infrastructure has done considerable amount of work. Thus, what I say about hardware of connectivity has to be associated with software of connectivity. The software part is perhaps not there. Larger political sense that I have is that, if you see the trajectory that our South Asia policy has taken, when the economic reforms and liberalization began in the 1990s, I remember there was a sense, these pesky neighbors around us, just forget about them, you should just go over them and connect yourself with this very dynamic, Southeast Asia, East Asia. You don't really need to worry about these fellows. That then gave rise to what I said about Vajpayee, because that was the high point, that neighborhood is the key. I think in some sense we have almost, come in a circle, because today, again, there seems to be a sense that, yeah, neighborhood is important. Yes, you should say neighborhood first. But really, we are playing a much bigger game, both in the region as well as, and perhaps not so much attention needs to be given here. That is unfortunate. So one of the things that perhaps you can look at is, it is now being suggested that SAARC is irrelevant. Focus attention on, say, BIMSTEC. I have argued that one is not, in fact, a substitute for the other. Even if SAARC has not really made much progress, it is because the members have not allowed it to make much progress, but it is something that should not be abandoned. That is certainly something that I would feel. The second aspect is, of course, the recognition, even though connectivity is there, the recognition that we really need to put in place what other regions have put in place in Southeast Asia, in Europe, which despite concerns about, say, security, illegal immigration, drug trafficking, etc., they have found ways through the use of very new sophisticated technology to actually address those concerns and allow actually a free movement of people. Why are we not able to do that? But I have talked enough. The floor is yours. Thank you.
I'm sure there'll be lots more to say in the years to come. Thanks so much for inviting me here. Thank you, Yamini, and thank you, Ambassador Saran, for your kind words. I have to say, I've always felt connected to the Center for Policy Research. I've often wondered why I felt like a child of CPR. You called me a friend of CPR. I felt like a child of CPR because I grew up with the idea of the contesting narratives that CPR was able to engage with. When I first became a journalist, I had an office just across the road from here, and it was to CPR I would turn for experts for a lot of my stories. And I just realized that we were both born in 1973. So, so that's possibly one of the big reasons. It's also a pleasure and a privilege to speak about an issue where I don't often get to talk about it. I almost have to ram down the idea of South Asia through a lot of readers and viewers and listeners who basically say to me, this is an irrelevant conversation. We've tried, we failed, we will not succeed in the future. And when I've looked for hope, it is to the stalwarts I see here who have been a part of the diplomatic service and cannot be called idealists without being realists in any sense of the word. They're practitioners. And if they believe it can happen, I think we have a pretty good chance of finding out in the future when it can. So I do want to talk about the idea of India and South Asia and why the future is really regional. The truth is South Asia is not a term that comes off comfortably from for many Indians. Off their tongues. It is not a term that anyone wanted to really use, particularly in India. And I've often wondered about that because, when you go to the rest of the subcontinent, which was a more preferred term, you will find a greater acceptance for South Asia. In India, maybe there was an idea that if you use the term Indian subcontinent, that gave India its rightful geographic and rightful place in the region's hierarchy in that sense. As a result, when the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation was first talked about in the 1980s, of course, it was Bangladesh's Zia Rahman who first held that conference and tried to push it. It was seen very much as a platform for other countries in the region to sort of gang up on India. And to find ways to make life more difficult for India, not to make the region a lot easier. Many officials, in fact, and I've read up a little bit about this from even before the 1980s, many officials actually believed that the South Asian construct was, quote unquote, an American ploy to reduce India's influence in the region. This belief, in fact, was fueled, I found out later, by the fact that the first official reference to South Asia, if you go back in time, was, I believe there are other references that have been made in the 1940s, but post that, was at a US State Department report that was titled The Subcontinent of South Asia, Afghanistan, Ceylon, India, Nepal, and Pakistan, Ceylon, of course, being Sri Lanka. And this was published in 1959. There was also at the time a very, sort of hotly debated phrase, the balance of power, Mrs. Gandhi referred to it after the 71 war as well. The balance of power theory really meant that in the decades after independence, particularly the American courtship of Pakistan, was driven much less by bilateral concerns for the US and more by a desire to restrain this big power, India, from acquiring the ability to dominate the rest of the region. So you can understand why there was a certain amount of suspicion through the ages. I remember after 1971, Mrs. Gandhi actually said in an interview that this has now put that whole balance of power theory to rest. Now, in a very strange sense, as Ambassador Saran said as well, since 2015, and I always use 2015 because 2014 was the last SAARC summit that was held. Many of the processes continued until 2015, possibly the end of 2015, but after that, they were at an end. This is now once again the world that India has begun to inhabit, where the construct of South Asia is seen with suspicion, even derision. And instead of the US, it is China that is dealing with India's neighbors in the subcontinent with a view to contain India's growth. That's the perception. Why is it then that while India's adversaries, okay, so even if I accept both these constructs, that the US did it for the same reasons, China did it for the other same reasons, that while India's adversaries that have been different at different times are able to see that India's relationship with its neighbors is a force multiplier that will enable India to leapfrog onto the global high table, why is it so difficult for us in India to accept that? Conversely, it is believed that it is these relationships that actually are keeping India enmeshed in its problems in its vicinity and really can be the roadblock to India's aspirations. So when the head looks at it, it should seem extremely rational. And today I am not going to refer to Yamini's construct, which is absolutely valid, of the great bonds across South Asia, how you cannot go to a South Asian country and not understand the humor or the language or the literature or the movies. There's so much, enmeshed between all of these countries. But I'm not going to speak about them. I'm going to speak about the realpolitik, if you like, reasons for why the region is the future. To begin with, there are many global developments. And so if we were only to look at the last few years, there are many global developments that are driving the growth of regionalization. So whether we want to see it in our region or not, you look around the world, there's a greater sense that nations are seeking out regional coalitions rather than the grander ones, or are not looking at simply being alone in the world and singular powers in that sense. The first reason really is that divisions and polarization of the kind we saw in the Cold War era are really back. We are now looking at a time of polarization, whether you want to call it the beginning of a bipolar world again or otherwise, because the schisms we are seeing, whether it was between the US and Russia over Ukraine or US and China now, and the kind of complete lack of trust of each other's intentions, I don't think since World War II, we have seen this kind of polarization. And why do I say it? Because if you look at how we have, halved the world up in terms of where we stand on certain issues, whether it was the Ukraine war, where you saw not only trade being completely bifurcated, or you saw travel routes being cut off between Russia and other countries. You also saw sort of cultural, separation completely, where you had philharmonic orchestras saying you cannot be the conductor of this orchestra unless you denounce the country you come from. This kind of schism where the mind itself is, the minds themselves are separating, political, economic, cultural, is at a point that we have possibly not seen since World War II, since the world decided on not just creating the United Nations, on saying never again, and on trying to build the idea of a world and the institutions that followed, whether it was a UNESCO, whether it was a WTO, a WHO, the idea was that we were looking at a much more global narrative. The second part to that, and it's a little separate, is the exit of the idea of globalization. And I think this really comes from the idea since perhaps the 2008 collapse, financial collapse, where globalization lost a lot of its cachet. Many have talked about the elephant graph. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it basically shows that the countries that most benefited from globalization were not the big players. It was the smaller countries and the smaller economies and the less developed economies that benefited from globalization. And there became a sense of the body of the elephant, if you like, that basically said, what are we getting out of globalization except for this kind of complete insecurity? As a result, as globalization lost some of its cachet, it also lost some of its cachet with COVID, where people started to see the spread of the virus actually a product of globalization and the fact that everyone was traveling everywhere. When in a time when it is not possible to go back to completely nationalistic, hyper-nationalistic narratives when it comes to trade, regionalization has really become what many would call the Goldilocks option. A third reason has been the definition of foreign policy that has changed due to populism around the world, authoritarian leaders around the world, the advent of transactionalism, xenophobia, protectionism, villainization of others that you don't necessarily understand. All of this has led to a kind of tribalism, if you like. I think I most recently read this in a piece by Bruno Massais, who spoke about the tribalization of foreign policy. And that, again, is pushing up the forces of regionalization. And finally, I think this is a trend, and we have to engage with it. It's not just India who is talking about a reform of the UN Security Council that includes in India. The fact is that the United Nations has been tested in the recent past, and in the recent past, I say in the recent past because it has worked at times, has continuously failed. It has failed to stop the war in Ukraine. It has failed to stop the daily bombardment of Gaza that we have seen over the past 2 months. We have not seen any of the UN institutions being able to work against the assault, if you like, of the first 3 indicators I just gave you, in a way that is effective, in a way that it is seen as a strong power. There is now a general understanding that the UN as it is doesn't necessarily work. And there are those, the aspirants like India, that feel that we really need a new system. We need something that changes, that brings all of us into it. It is a non-representative body. It is a body that right at the top, and I think I said this at the last time I'd come to CPR, is just seen as an unjust world order based on the idea of those who were defined as the victors of the Second World War nearly 100 years ago. So it needs to be replaced. The international rule of law and order, as a result, is not being adhered to by anyone, and certainly not to anyone who's supposed to actually be taking it forward. You know, the US, its allies like the UK and France and Russia and China are now seen as the worst offenders on many of these issues. So now we come to South Asia, where we have seen, as a result of this global situation that I just described, a common set of problems. One is the economic problem, and that is an ongoing thing, even though we know that our GDP has recovered somewhat. The fact is that economic distress is a thing in South Asia. You don't need numbers, you just need 2 eyes to see that. Some of it has also been impacted by the COVID impact. I think there was a study by ADB that talked about how much South Asian economies in particular are going to drop, but there's between a 1 to 10% drop in GDPs that occurred just coming out of COVID. What that meant was not just the loss of jobs and revenue, and also the impact of the disease itself and what the many deaths meant, but of areas like tourism, where so many South Asian countries, if you look at Nepal, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, are completely dependent on, I mean, more than the others, of remittances as well. South Asia is the largest procurer of remittances. India is the largest country. And all of us send labor across the world that then sends money back home. And there's been a major drop in that. The second thing that all South Asian countries are feeling as a common set of problems is the driving of these factors into poverty. And that has been increased by the sense of protectionism in many of the larger global economies. The US now has a series of acts that essentially is moving manufacturing back to the US. China is where it is. There's a closing of border, a rupturing of supply chains that is not necessarily going to help us. And in South Asia, its impact has been felt more. The third is the climate crisis. And it's any way you slice it, your future challenge is going to come from the climate crisis. We can keep talking about our political issues and what has been created by man, but the real threat to the world that has been created by man, unless you're a denier of that theory, is the climate change crisis. Every year, one major natural disaster hits the South Asian region. And this is not just in our thinking that, oh, we're reading the news and therefore we keep looking at disasters just in our region. 20 out of 23 major cyclone disasters in the world in the past have occurred around the Bay of Bengal region. Global warming, coastal degradation, soil salinity, water scarcity, all of them cause the deaths of thousands in South Asia each year. Therefore, and the second part of that, of course, is the major pollution crisis that we are all dealing with, the contamination crisis. The ADP now predicts a decrease of 11% in South Asian GDPs by 2100, so end of the century, if business as usual, what is called BAU emissions, are maintained. So if we don't do anything about it, that's where we're going to be. With global warming and sea levels rising, other estimates predict, and this is a real number in a study, there will be 63 million climate migrants from South Asia by 2050. When you look around the world and see the environment for refugees, particularly if they don't come from a Western country, you understand the meaning of what 63 million climate migrants is going to mean. And of course, India and South Asia have been seen as what is called a hunger hotspot. So when we look at pollution, we look at water pollution, we look at air pollution, we can see that our region is suffering. And strangely, we hear the same stories from the rest of the region. It's not just India that's a culprit. It's an all. And I'll come back to that point on pollution and climate change, because I think that is very important. But the fourth real common problem, if you like, that we are facing, or India is facing with its neighbors, is that the area of South Asia has been turned into an area of contestation between the global powers. The US-China competition is now a thing across the region. We're seeing, on the face of it, more military and strategic pacts being signed with various countries in South Asia, which will pull those countries, including India, one way or the other. You're also seeing more competing projects between the two. We've seen that in the Maldives, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, all these places. You're seeing a contestation. In the old days, it was India's backyard, if you like. That's no longer the case. None of our neighbors are accepting that term, really. And as a result, we're seeing that contestation from the global powers much more. If you look at Nepal, till a little while ago, it was all about India, China. Today, if you go to Kathmandu, there's a lot more talk about US versus China there. And each of these global powers are offering not an a la carte option. They're not saying you take this from us and you take that from us. They're saying, here's the buffet. You're either with us or without us. So a country like Bangladesh, for example, that has been able to manage, giving some rail routes on one side to China, some rail routes to India, working with India and Japan on certain bridges and with China on others. Those options are now going away. And here I come really to the crux of what I wanted to speak about, which is that the solutions to each of these problems actually can be found from the regional aspect, as other regions of the world have already found. The first, free trade areas work best in geographically connected regions. I mean, this is just a fact by example. South Asia as a region is lagging, while the European Union, RCEP, Part of that is ASEAN, the Gulf, GCC, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, Mercosur for all of South America, the USMCA. These are all what are driving, the EEAU, for example. These are all what are driving trade in these countries. In fact, regional trade now makes up for more than half of all global trading. South Asia, and here I will turn to the obvious, which is it is a unit. You know, when Ambassador Saran said, you can't just replace the SAARC construct or the South Asian construct with a BIMSTEC and a BBIN. It is because if you just look at a map, a relief map of this region, we do have, you know, the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush to the north. We do have the Indian Ocean to the south. It is an area distinct from a West Asia or a Central Asia or a Southeast Asia. And this is a region that has become the exception to this rule on free trade agreements. We were almost ahead of the times when we discussed a South Asian Free Trade Agreement, a SAFTA, and put it into place, I think, in the year 2000. But today it lies in shambles. Another area, and you spoke a little bit about what this is changing, is and here I'm talking about solutions. So, you know, SAFTA is a solution. Implementing more regional trade is one of the big solutions. Another one is the alleviation of poverty from cross-border linkages. Just an hour ago, actually, another think tank, the CSEP, has just released a study, which I would urge all of you to read, that talks about how cross-border linkages are actually having an impact on poverty in those areas right next to the border. As we know, traditionally, our poorest have lived alongside our borders. In 2013, the study says close to 200 million people lived in the border districts of South Asia. 1/3 lived in districts that were unconnected across the border. And there were 35 million people in all in these districts unconnected. What the study says is recent regional trade and connectivity liberalization initiatives may be paying off with increased trade intensity across borders. The study found that poverty declined faster in connected districts, and among the connected districts, well-connected districts witnessed faster poverty reduction. This is obviously looking at India, Nepal, India, Bhutan, and India, Bangladesh borders. But think about the possibilities if our neighbor to the west was able to somehow restart the conversation with us, and we were able to restart that conversation. The amount of poverty alleviation across South Asia would see a definite change. Now, Pakistan, I believe, has refused talks with India. And it's not just Pakistan that has refused the talks. There's been a lot of, you did this, and then we did this, and you did this, and we did this. But as we stand today, Pakistan has said that it cannot go back to talks until the August 5th, 2019 actions are reversed. And I think it is to its own detriment, because this period has also coincided with a lot of other work happening in the region. It stands to miss out on being part of the South Asia energy grid that is talked about. This is something that was opposed in India until I think 2018. We actually had a policy that said we will not accept energy from any of our neighbors into this cross-border, it was called the CBTE, cross-border trade in electricity guidelines. But we were, in a sense, pushed to it by our neighbors, and for the better, so that we now can talk, at least theoretically, about a South Asia energy grid that will power, you know, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal. You know, in Nepal and Bhutan will find more buyers for their electricity. Bangladesh, a rapidly growing country, will get more supply. Even Sri Lanka is now wanting to be a part of the South Asian energy grid, and people are looking, there are actually surveys going on about how that can happen. The same as a result is true of these cross-border roads I just spoke about, riverine channels that we are building, and of course, new air routes, which is very exciting when you see new air routes come up between, say, between India and Sri Lanka, including, I think, the new flight to Jaffna that many have taken. You realize that we are going back to some of the routes we always knew existed, but haven't had so much access to. I think India has also lost its opportunities in some of this. And neighborhood first, while a great concept, has meant much more in a bilateral sense with these countries than it has meant neighborhood together. We still don't have the concept of the neighborhood together first. And as a result, phrases such as Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, diplomacy and dialogue is the only way forward, begin to sound a bit hollow, especially when compared to the act of India and Pakistan really holding up SAARC from having meetings for now nearly a decade. I never thought I'd say this. There was always a point at which we would say, eventually we'll go back to SAARC. But now I think the writing is pretty much on the wall unless somebody decides to take a decisive and visionary step. But the contradictions remain. In the last year, we have seen India being able to hold 2 Global South meetings virtually, an SCO meeting, a summit level meeting virtually, which includes, by the way, the Pakistani leadership, and yet is unable to participate or convene a regional dialogue to discuss more or less the same issues. And I've just listed for you how these issues affect us all. Or even to include this regional agenda into India's G20 narrative. This was the moment. I mean, everybody has gone through the idea that the G20 goes by rotation from country to country, and each country looks to bring something from their region into it. So it is a lost opportunity. And finally, I said I'd come back to the idea of air pollution. A recent World Bank study concluded that about 2 million people die prematurely across South Asia each year as a result of particulate measure concentrations, and that 9 South Asian cities are among the world's 10 top affected by air pollution. I mean, that's a real red mark across South Asia, and the fact that we are not looking at solutions together for it. Even countries like Bhutan and Maldives, for no fault of their own, really, are now dealing with some of the smog that comes from the Himalayan region, actually. Success stories in other parts of the world, including countries like the ASEAN, European alpine nations built a project just to do this, and China, because it has so many regions in China. The solution to air pollution, this study found, lies in a whole of region approach, or what is called airshed management, and that no one country can resolve this on its own. Both metaphorically and literally as a result, we must make this smog in thinking clear out. We ignore our regional future to all our perils in that sense, as we allow bilateral differences between states to hold up regionalization. SAARC to the west, but even BIMSTEC to the east hasn't moved much more forward. It doesn't have the same ballast, even in its own charter, that SAARC does for the region. That we still don't have transit trade through the region and have actually gone back in time. When you see disused train tracks, when you see disused road routes, the Grand Trunk Road to begin with, that are no longer in use, you realize we are actually today in 2023 at a place far worse than where we were. That our students go elsewhere to study, and I'm not going to bore you with those studies, but they are there. They have been done to find where Indian students are going to study, where tourists are going as well. That our students go elsewhere to study and our tourists go elsewhere to travel, and our people seek out opportunities outside the region instead of seeking collaborations within it. We have all this outsourcing power, software professionals across South Asia, and yet the collaborations are very little. We end up always just competing with each other. That our supply chains too lead outside the region, and intra-regional trade is at just 5% when the rest of the world has achieved 55%. That we don't have a common platform on climate change, on reparations for example, with the loss and damage, on healthcare, on labor rights. After all, it's all South Asian labor that's going to these countries. Why are we not able to negotiate a better deal for all South Asians on remittances, and become, if possible, a cartel of buyers? In the Ukraine crisis, when it came to buying oil, we were the only region that didn't sort of even explore the idea of being a kind of cartel, because so much of that oil was coming into the region. These are all places that we have missed out on. And for this last bit, I'd like to address the future generation, if I may. Your great-grandfathers and mothers knew what an integrated region meant pre-partition and often thought that, yes, we could go back to those days. Your grandfathers and mothers may not have had such a positive or hopeful impression of our neighbors, but they benefited from the family connections that endured, from the visas and the travel routes that still existed. From 1985 to 2015, my generation understood the concept of SAARC and South Asia. While borders and mines were indeed closing, journalists like me were able to travel to every South Asian country and travel to some of them quite regularly. I can remember that time. So I'm privileged to have seen all of that. But the next generation does not know what lies beyond some of India's boundaries. How many in the next generation can tell you that they have walked across a borderline in the manner that European children today do, and felt that sense of being just able to be a step away from the neighbor? While travel routes and border crossings have in fact improved with some, but not with others, and certainly we are not closer together. You know, a European leader told me a year ago that we were always taught that humans behave like humans, but that states must behave like rational actors. They consider national and global interests before taking any steps. In that sense, in South Asia at present, we are behaving like humans that put petty rivalries over what our head and actually even our heart must be telling us. India's role at the global high table, therefore, cannot be achieved without its neighbors. And it is necessary that India is engaged in the growth of its neighborhood and that its neighbors are, as a turn, stakeholders in our success. And that's where I think the future lies. Thank you. Where?
Thank you, Suhasini. I think you have made a very persuasive case for why we should have an interconnected, interdependent South Asia. And I share your sense of regret that perhaps the coming generation or even the present young generation is their sense of belonging to that larger identity is dimming day by day. And this, I think, is really going to be a big challenge. There is also the issue of, those emotional linkages, because I think one of the great things about South Asia is that no matter where you go, you see and experience the kind of very deep affinities which unite us with our neighbors. But that is also a product of familiarity, product of engagement. And so if that sense of familiarity and engagement begins to diminish over a period of time, then those kind of affinities will also perhaps become less of a driver of that South Asian identity than there should be. So let me, of course, thank Suhasini for an absolutely brilliant presentation. And the floor is open. Okay, the first comment from Gautam.
Thank you, Suhasini, for that tour de force, completely panoramic view that looks at, particularly, I think, the challenges and the opportunities. And I think especially like that you addressed it from a kind of realpolitik lens, not a romantic lens, or even a cultural lens. All that is there. In fact, I've always been struck about the magnitude of interest in India, politics, let alone films, that there is in our region, and the magnitude of admiration for our democracy, of our pluralism, things that in some ways we are eroding by the year. So I think we're losing a lot of capital with that as well. So let me just ask you two questions broadly in this. One is that you talked about this one single, let's say, decisive visionary step that a potentially future leader could take, to change the thinking about in India, about the region. What imagination could such steps be? And the second is, what should be the basic template of our relations with our neighbors? We've had this, I think Zorawar Daulat Singh wrote this interesting book in which he analyzed the foreign policy, the neighborhood policy of Nehru, which was largely benign neglect, of Indira Gandhi, which was, assertion of your superiority. And then you've had sort of, the two approaches. One is the benign and friendly approach, and the other is the tough approach. And over a period of time, what has gained currency is really the tough, security-driven, selfish interest. And the selfish interest is universal. I mean, it starts off with America first, but now it is literally each and every country first, which is effectively a kind of Hobbesian state of international relations, which in my view is just simply not tenable, anymore. But even within the Big Brother syndrome, there are two different ideas of Big Brother. There is the idea of Big Brother when, let's say, India bails out, let's say, Nepalese citizens stranded in Qatar, or not Qatar, let's say, any of the hotspots which have been affected, where it's a benign Big Brother. And then there is the other notion of the Big Brother, which is the bully. So in this spectrum, do you think we have the luxury of choice? Of course, naturally, everybody will say you need a smart combination of both. But if you had to lean towards one, would a softer approach be better or a harder approach?
Many very interesting questions there, but your last one I could possibly answer in a glib fashion and say that Machiavelli said it is better to be feared than to be loved. The worst possible option is to be neither feared nor loved. And I fear that in the geographical region that we are, there's always a bigger brother around. And if you go by the Mandela concept of my enemy's enemy being my friend, India has to work that much harder to follow through on that kind of tough position. I think the kind of sentiments that have been vocalized at various points, and even by the current government and the current foreign minister, of the idea of not necessarily looking at reciprocity. That means I do this for somebody, they do this for me, because it's not possible. What your neighbor is going to give you in terms of, ballast, in terms of a friendly relationship, is worth much, much more than perhaps a road or a riverine channel that you can build or put money in for. So I think that these are not quantifiable gives and takes. And they have to be with the idea that we are committed to a regional approach, that we do think that having an open region is to the benefit of all our citizens, and then we work from there. Instead of necessarily making it about reciprocity and non-reciprocity, because that again sets into place the giver and the taker and the big and the small and all the rest. Kishore Mehbubani wrote this book about the ASEAN miracle. And many who may have waded through all the reasons why the ASEAN countries were able to come together may have skipped one particular subchapter on why SAARC has not approached it in the same way. One of the things that he writes over there is that it became very clear, while the difference, the size differential between India and each of its neighbors is huge. Even India and Pakistan is so large, that if you look at the ASEAN countries, Indonesia is far much bigger than all the others. And he says that it was a sort of construct of its leaders that when they would form ASEAN, it would not be Indonesia taking the lead. In fact, they pushed Singapore to take the lead because they felt that that would be not as threatening to the others in the grouping. Another point he makes is the importance, and we are personalized countries. Our leaders are larger than life. And the fact is that our leaders in South Asia certainly sometimes last decades. So in that sense, the importance of having that leader-to-leader, a conversation is very important. And it is our misfortune, if you ask me, in South Asia, that we've never had, 7 or 8 leaders who were all on the same page at the same time. At different times, different leaders in South Asia have actually enunciated a regional vision. I think today, for example, it is the Sri Lankan president who speaks much more about the importance of regional trade than some of the others. But there have been times where, they have not been the most forward-looking on this. So I think when you ask about what is that visionary step, I think it is necessary for every leader in the region, but particularly the Indian leadership, to realize the necessity of taking a backseat, but allowing that regional narrative to form, and B, of insisting on allowing the exact opposite of really what we're doing right now, where we will not allow the SARC to be held for any reason. I mean, there were different suggestions made. One suggestion was because basically SARC today is held up. The SARC summit is held up because it's Pakistan's turn to host. So the choice is either that Pakistan gives up its turn to host and moves it along to the next person. And in SARC's 40-year history, to be fair, it has always been a problem when it's either Pakistan or India that is the host. So one step was to say neither country hosts, and you just move between the others. Another one was, if you can hold the SCO virtually and the Global South virtually, just hold the SARC virtually and move it on to the next country. So that was another. The third was the option that, SARC says head of state or head of government, and that you allow the presidents, the two countries or vice presidents to officiate and not necessarily get into the contentious areas you would otherwise. So the lack of that kind of vision in favor of what seems to be an isolationist approach, to me, is really the step that can actually be reversed.
One follow-up question, Suhasini. When Prime Minister Modi took the initiative of inviting South Asian countries for his swearing in, do you think he had the kind of bud of such an idea? Or do you think somehow that
I definitely think that invitation came from a good place, from the idea. The problem with that idea is that it began to look to our neighbors after a little while, that it was about anointing the regional leader rather than any kind of coming together. As a result, until in fact, I think 2018 and the swearing in of President Soli, Prime Minister Modi has not gone to anybody else's swearing in, even though he has been invited. So, I mean, maybe, they should have put it into SARC that after 2014, every swearing in of any SARC country leader should have all the leaders come together. That's the way ASEAN really built it. They built it over golf tournaments between the leaders and that sort of thing. And, so possibly if that step had been taken forward, it would have meant something more.
Thank you.
Any other?
Namita had a
Thank you, Suhasini, for this riveting talk. I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on your beginning remarks, which was about the nature of polarization in the global order, and sort of push back, not because I don't agree with you that the future is regional. I think that is really important, but also to bat for the global in a way, because I'm wondering, like, so this is kind of cyclical in a way that we have these periods of polarization in the global order. And when you talk about leader to leader cooperation, on the one hand, that is, the fact that these leaders last decades gives them enormous powers to be authoritarian and, push forward policies that are not necessarily for the benefit, populist policies that are not necessarily for the benefit of the people. And if they are able to, so, the flip side of what you're suggesting is that if they are able to sort of concentrate power through these leadership sort of, deals with each other and keep their population subjugated in a way that they cannot counter the authoritarian forces, that would be very dangerous for those of us who believe in democratic values and who want them to succeed in a very difficult time. And also relatedly to that, the role of the UN. I mean, there's lots of people who are saying that, the UN may just collapse now. And I think that is a very, very, very worrying prospect for the world and for the region, because even if the Security Council is totally dysfunctional, there are so many agencies of the UN who are still doing so much, not just in the Israel-Palestine conflict, but in the region as well with Myanmar, the fact that the International Criminal Court is now, trying, Myanmarese military for genocide. I mean, that case is further along than the Israeli case, but they've also started an investigation in the Israeli case. And of course, the International Criminal Court is part of the Rome Statute, not necessarily like part of the UN, but it is part of the global order. So sort of, agreeing with you entirely, but asking you to reflect a little bit on how we can strengthen the global order, because I feel that's really important. And some of the, while what you're saying for poverty alleviation, in border areas and all that may happen through these regional collaborations and so on. But the ability, like, the fact that the close relationship between Indian and Bangladeshi leadership, and how, both leadership are authoritarian in their own context, and what that means for the people, if you could reflect on that.
So to begin with, I don't think that there is a regional answer to authoritarianism. The truth is that each of us has to fight that battle for our own governance nationally. It is true, as Ambassador Mukhopadhyay said, that India has for years been a source of, inspiration for our neighbors, many of whom had never seen a democratic government, or had had decades of military rule. Even so, when you traveled in the region, they looked to India for its democracy, not just for its democracy, but for all the, the essentials of that, which meant space for dissent, which meant a respect for the universal values on human rights. And they looked to one day when they could, meet that. We are definitely not inspiring them as much today as we once did. It becomes more difficult as a result for a regional leader like India to give lectures. And I've written about this, that, how do you give lectures to the Sri Lankan government on enforcing its articles in the constitution that deal with devolution? How do you give Maldives a lecture on authoritarianism and locking up its opposition leaders? I'm talking about the Yamin government previously. How do you tell Nepal to have a constitution that is more egalitarian when you yourself are passing laws that don't seem to be so? So I agree with you over there, but I don't think that there is a regional answer to it. I mean, the ASEAN countries have not found a regional answer to Myanmar. They've tried everything, even to get a meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi has been so difficult for the ASEAN leadership. So I think these are battles we have to fight on our own. Coming back to your question about the UN, nowhere would I want to suggest that I think that the UN as a concept should just go away. There is a point at which we all adhere to universal values, and if we don't, and if I may make a political statement here, if we believe that there is something called a right to self-defense that includes the killing of thousands of children, it's not a universal value. People are pushing back against it. I also think that the United Nations as a concept, as somebody has said, if we didn't have one, we would invent it, right? In the 1830s, I think it was Lord Tennyson who wrote the Parliament of Man, and very much the same concept. At that time, it was a Parliament of Man that was dealing with, in a sense, colonial powers, that they were coming out of, of colonialism of that sort in the West, not so much on our side. In the 1940s, when before you came to the United Nations, you came to the League of Nations. And that was, again, kept half the world out. Then the United Nations came. Over time, you've seen things like the Group of 77, look at other parts of the world. Today, we talk about the Global South. The question is not, can the UN as a concept survive? I think it'll always survive. I just don't think that it is, as it is working right now, is able to enforce the kind of international rule of law, international respect for human rights, international cessation of hostilities. I mean, the fact that you have to go to the UN General Assembly to pass a resolution that calls for a ceasefire should straight away tell us something is really wrong. So you have to start with the UN Security Council, but you also have to look at what the WHO did with COVID. You also have to look at how the WTO has worked with certain Western nations and not with us. The fact that in the middle of the COVID pandemic, India and South Africa got together put out a proposal that just said, look, if we have the COVID pandemic, as bad as it is, can you just put off your trips and trips for like literally for the period of the pandemic, so that people don't have to worry about getting not just vaccines, PPE, suits, and other, medicines that you needed for COVID. And the WTO couldn't. I think the WTO will finally even consider that proposal maybe next year, by which time, nobody will really care about it.
COVID.
So my point is something's broken. It has to be fixed.
Okay. Any other question? Yes, please.
I have just 2 or 3 from the Zoom, which I can merge together. Maybe we can take both questions so that, yes, okay, actually, there's some, we had a bunch of questions on Zoom, which I'll take the risk of summarizing also because it kind of ropes in some of the questions I had in mind, which have a, so at the heart of the questions is the kind of India is at this point in time in against the backdrop of real politics, seeking alignments of all kinds. You spoke about the SCO. There is of course also Quad, which occupies a lot of our space. And, in some senses, I think you said it's sort of multi-alignment, all in alignment. And in the midst of this all alignment, the absence of an interest in alignment within South Asia is almost starker. And so, some of our Zoom listeners are asking whether it's detrimental. Has this search for all alignment, multi-alignment, all alignment become detrimental to the idea of free trade promotion within the region, of peace within the region? And I would add also, it's just distracting in a sense, because the idea is, it's the way the normative positioning for India is to look outside of the region rather than recognize all the things that you very rightly said, which are central to the ability of the country to, in fact, take its neighborhood along and be a leader and therefore play a more significant role on the global stage. So are we kind of assuming that by virtue of being the new kid on the block that everyone wants to align with, that we can get away with all the hard structural problems of really building our region? You want to take other questions? And I think he had a question, so we can take his.
Thank you very much. You have given a very wide view of South Asia. But in this global world, you find, there are 2 axes. One is America and the NATO forces, and the other is Russia, China. So in that eventuality, you don't fit anywhere. The South Asian region is decimated. You were under sanctions for 30 years. And we have no values in the eyes of Chinese, Russians. Russians do have given us some sort of relief at the hour when we needed. But my hunch is that where we stand internationally, when China is growing, then America is pushing you ahead. I don't feel South Asian has got any relevance, because even if you send your children to the South Asian countries, they are not, they will never refuse to go. One of the countries, Malaysia, has been developing very fast. Now that has subsided also. So in that eventuality, what sort of role can India, with now it is improving, you have not touched the political stability of the country, which is the mainstay for the region to grow, and how far we can go and ascertain. Russians' friendship is okay, but what else we need to do?
Okay, so to the first question of whether looking outside of the region has, in a sense, come at the cost of our interest in South Asia, I think there's no question about it, because it seems as if the one place where we don't want to put much focus is this one particular grouping. And honestly, it is about the idea of isolating one particular country, which is not a really viable idea over time. I mean, when you look at the fact that the biggest sort of Western powers got together just in 2022 and said, we are going to isolate Russia, and how badly they have failed in doing it. I saw a Russian tweet today from one of their embassies putting out a video of President Putin flying to the COP I think, to the UAE. And the idea that as he was welcomed, not only did he have jets flying alongside him, but as the jets peeled off, they put out the Russian flag over there. It's quite a startling sort of video. But the point is that it has so badly failed. When you had the world's biggest powers with all the influence in the world. So the idea, I mean, I was a little disheartened to hear you say that, South Asia is nowhere on the map. Yes, it is nowhere on the map for anyone else, but it should be on the map for ourselves. How can we tell ourselves that we don't matter and that we don't exist? And we do make our presence felt in many different ways. There is a South Asian ethos, which has not had time to develop together. But when you see your immediate reactions, I'm not counting the recent UNGA vote, but last year, and it's not just South Asia. If you look at the global South, there is a reason. 40 countries decided to sanction Russia. 40 countries joined the coalition to sanction Russia. It started out with about 30, it became about 40. 140 voted to say that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was wrong. But only 40 joined the sanctions. What does that mean? Even when you look at the Israel UNGA vote, and of course, India has been leading by abstention, if you like, but not really leading because nobody else in South Asia is following us on our abstentions. They're all voting. You can see that there is a genuine desire to hold certain principles dear. Because if we decide as a region we don't count and only big powers count, then eventually we are going to work ourselves into a world that is worse than pre-World War II, frankly. It's not even going to be the post-World War II scenario. As far as the question on the idea of looking outside of the region and not here, I think we have to start with ourselves. Ask your children today, or if you are kids, ask yourself today, how many of you think about travel in the region? And I do this regularly, not just in India. I've done this in Pakistan as well. I've done this in Nepal as well, where I go to a college and I say to them, put up your hands and tell me how many people have been abroad. And lots of hands go up. And then you whittle it down to how many of you have actually traveled in South Asia. And it comes down, and then some say Sri Lanka for a holiday, Nepal for a holiday. And then you say how many of you have crossed by foot on a land boundary, and you come down to 0 or 1. And isn't that sad? I mean, that's basically where we've put ourselves, that in our imagination, we get on a plane and we're in another country. We cannot imagine that there is a world at our borders that's there. You can't get rid of them. They're always going to be there.
Yes. On a very personal note, I walked across the border with my daughter when she was pregnant, when I was pregnant with her, and and now it looks like that will be the only time that she'll ever have been able to visit Pakistan, even though my sister was born there. So.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. Ma'am, I'd like to draw your attention to a few points. That is, we talk about Indian diaspora here, right? The Indian people, our language is spoken. You know that the Tajik speak also Indian, the Uzbek speak, the Kyrgyz and the Kazakhs do. This is one region. Then there's Myanmar, that has 1,400-kilometer border, common border. Then Thai and our island just next door to them. Then Indra Point is next door to Indonesia. Now, why do we leave out this region? Why can't we have talk about them as well? This is number one. Number two, this is very important. Everybody talks, but people are failing to talk 2 points. That is very important. That is killing us. And that is the purchasing power. I'm not talking per capita income. Per capita income doesn't help people because we distribute the 1 billion down to the people down there. I talk per capita. I talk about the falling purchasing power of the people is going down and down. We are progressing. They're talking so much. I will not bull the talk so much, but the power is going down day by day, and this population is exploding. No matter what you do, everything will nullify. Now, another point I want to raise about the last, the potentials of our people. They're the same people. About 150 years ago. They went around the world to build the world in the Kenya, the railway lines. We also worked for the Panama Canal and Indies, in the West Indies, and all over the world. I don't want to name it. Now today, we want to build a railroad connectivity from India to where?
Southeast Asia.
So Southeast Asia, all the way Southeast Asia, Vietnam, right up to Hanoi. That plan is on the drawing board till today. And look at China. They have reached to the Indian Ocean this way and that way and everywhere. They have new plan to build roads in the forest. Right. But what are we doing? We can do so much, but we can't tackle this falling price, falling purchasing power and the population.
We are running out of time. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thanks. This is just a pretty straightforward question, and something that has been playing on my mind for a while, which is, do you believe India has been increasingly seen as an ideological force in the region, a different kind of a hegemonic presence compared to the pre-2014 era?
That's a fairly profound question, and one I fear I should do some research on before I speak. But I think we have to remember, what is that ideology? If that ideology is to be a hard state, if that ideology is to be a majoritarian state, if that ideology is to be a state that doesn't think of India as a pluralistic, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, inclusive, secular democracy, if that is not to be that vision, and that is to be replicated in our neighborhood, what would that look like? Because the majorities are very different in each of our neighboring countries. So I do think that if it was to be true that India was to be a hegemon, in fact, I think our neighbors are sometimes reminding us about our own values a lot more. I think we would be in a lot more trouble. The problem is that all of these, and I come back to that answer, that all of these are issues that we have to resolve within us, and which is why I didn't touch too much on it, and I'm glad that Ambassador Mukhopadhyay spoke about these. Setting our values will always be a national exercise. It's not going to be a regional exercise. That is why I bring in the realpolitik rationale for dealing with the region more than others. Because I do think, yes, culture is lovely. We have so much in common with so many countries, as you pointed out. You go across Central Asia and you'll find something in common with everyone you meet. But there has to be some part of it is going to be part of our national exercise, our national duties and responsibilities. I can't go much further on that. And so for your question on why we don't go further, why don't we look at other countries we are connected to? And I do think the question on Myanmar is very important because it is connected to us by land. And I'm going to do the very sensible thing of handing this over to Ambassador Saran, because he's written about it in his book on the concentric circles around India. And why do we see our region as just our region and not further?
I think it's the opposite, that we think about the concentric circles, but we don't think of the most inner circle that all that is based on. That is
no, I think the question is, why do we say South Asia but don't include Indonesia or Myanmar? Or...
Well, I don't think there is an ideological issue there, because after all, we sponsored Afghanistan to be a part of SAARC. And if Myanmar were to express an interest in becoming part of SAARC, if SAARC was still existent, I do not think that India would have a problem. We, after all, made a huge effort to bring Myanmar into BIMSTEC when they were not very popular. So I don't think there is an issue with that. Indonesia would not want to be part of SAARC. They have their own sort of pretensions to greatness. So I don't think they are particularly keen to be part of South Asia. But can we wind up? So let me express the thanks of CPR and my own thanks to Suhasini for giving us a sort of a, as Gautam said, a tour de force of South Asia and what we are missing out on. And even if we are talking about real politics and that, perhaps we need some kind of idealism to be able to think about South Asia and South Asian identity, nothing could be further from the truth that it is for very, very real politic reasons why, in fact, you need to have much greater connect with your neighbors. It is not that we have not, at least today, understood the importance of cross-border linkages. As I said, considerable amount of work has taken place, certainly in terms of, their physical connectivity with our neighbors. A lot of effort has been made. In some areas, as you mentioned, the power grid, for example, some progress has been made. But we also must understand that there is a diplomatic challenge here because the more you try to do, sometimes it has happened that when you come up with a big idea, your neighbors shrink from that. So that is the other side of the story, that even if you want to do much more as a region, the region itself may not necessarily be very enthusiastic about it. So there are those psychological barriers, political barriers, which are very real. I mean, those of us who have actually served in the region, Gautam has served in Myanmar. I have served in Myanmar. I have served in Nepal. I have found that as soon as you start trying to do something a little more ambitious, there is an immediate, sort of block. Various reasons for it, but that is very real. So there is a diplomatic challenge in terms of what is it that you can do differently to give that sense of reassurance that is required in order to be able to push this forward. We sometimes ignore what is the other side. The other side, after all, as I say, you can't, clap with one hand. So the need to understand what are the forces at work in each of our neighboring countries, what in some cases has actually worked, and in other cases, it hasn't worked. I have found that a certain degree of incrementalism in taking things forward. As I say, if you try to swallow a big piece, it will get stuck in your throat. But if you break it into smaller pieces, perhaps you can take those in much more easily. So what is it in this context? What is it that is required to break up these things? What big picture that you have in mind? How do you break it up into smaller pieces so that it becomes easier for you to push this? So the other side of the coin, it needs also very careful study. Yeah. So I think you want to say something. Yeah.
One sort of big idea into this thing, particularly since Mr. Manishankar Iyer is also here. What about the idea? I can understand the resistance to opening our agricultural markets to international trade, but what are the trade-offs in opening a common agricultural market just for our region, or expanding it bit by bit? I mean, it could be the single one thing that can bring the region together.
Well, to some extent, bilaterally, you do that. I mean, there is a free trade in agricultural products with Nepal, for example. Maldives survives on that. To some extent, even Sri Lanka does. Even Nepal, to a very large extent. Bhutan. Every time there is some problem, rice export or that export, there is a huge reaction. So, in a sense, bilaterally, it is there with several countries. Yes, maybe you can think in terms of, but that becomes, are you ready to create a South Asia market for this? That's a bit difficult. Shall we? Thank you again, Suhasini, and thanks to all of you for coming here and also for the celebration of the 50th anniversary. And I hope this series will continue with more, excellent speakers like Suhasini to follow. Thank you.
Thank you.